Everything we know about Africa and how well or how poorly it's doing is essentially a lie. And today we're going to talk about it. This video is a book talk / review for the 2016 book, The Rise of Africa's Middle Class, Myths, Realities and Critical Engagements. It seems as though some have grown tired of the BS about Africa and, the surrounding narratives about it. And, collectively decided to do something about it. This book and another book I'm reading currently, Africa, Why Economists Get It Wrong, seem to be direct responses to the narratives of Africa's economic woes and successes. Both seem to be exaggerated, and both books set to put things straight. But this video is purely focusing on the rise of Africa's middle class. Let me get to my ratings for the book. Usefulness 90, engagement 86, depth 50, accuracy 80, clarity 70, uniqueness 95, book cover 65, overall score 77.32. And this is also a reminder to like and subscribe also. Thank you very much. This is a good book and one that I recommend reading for sure. This book is a multidisciplinary book, which for those who have seen my video about gendercide and genocide know it has become my favorite type of book to read. The academics in this book take a critical look at the highs and lows of certain countries within sub-Saharan Africa. One of the running critiques in this book that all the contributors touched on is the absurd monetary parameters for which constitutes the middle class in Africa, set by the African Development Bank and other institutions. In the book, and if you read it, you'll see the parameters vary wildly, and I'll get into that. I'll touch on it in a bit. And it kind of leaves everything in more of a mess than it needs to be, because already when you're talking about class, particularly the middle class, everything is already confusing, jumbled up. There's multiple videos and articles and essays about the shrinking middle class, what actually constitutes the middle class, what actually constitutes class, and all of the above. Part 1, using money to define the middle class. This book illustrates the feeble attempt by the African Development Bank to define the middle class by monetary standards. The problem with their definition, as we'll see, is that it's quite broad, and therefore it serves no use at all really. Here's a quote from the book. The poor class living from under $2 a day, the floating class $2 to $4 a day, the middle class living from $4 to $20, and the rich class with an income / consumption of more than $20 a day. This definition would mean that around roughly 34% or around 350 million or so people on the African continent were middle class in 2011. This is something that pretty much all the academics take aim in their respective chapters. It's particularly of note that the middle class category seems to have the widest monetary bandwidth by far, which to me is quite wild, but not unsurprising. You fit in a lot of people, when you're talking about those living from as little as $4 a day to $20 a day, which, is actually quite interesting because that definition is so broad, yet for the developed world, we're talking middle class. I'm from the UK. The parameters are, several £1,000s and dollars, maybe in tens of thousands of pounds and dollars and euros. So this book will get you thinking just about that, and it's good to see, good to read and see and hear about the middle class in Africa. Because even though, like I said earlier, there's videos and essays and articles about the middle class in the developed world, you don't hear about it in Africa. You really just hear about the poverty or the rich or corruption, really. Anyway, the book adds more definitions that have been set about what exactly is the middle class and how many people approximately are in it. And so the numbers vary upon different criteria that people and institutions have, of course. So in the book, for example, in the 2015 Global Annual Report, Credit Suisse puts the figure of such defined middle class on the continent at 18.8 million, with almost a quarter of it in South Africa, quite in contrast to the 300 to 500 million suggested earlier on by the African Development Bank. Suggestions suggest that it's actually not the middle which expands most in African societies, but the lower and upper levels, i.e. the lowest and highest segments. In the book, there's a table with, different organizations and institutions and their different estimates on how many people are in Africa's middle class. And so the numbers vary a lot. And it's wild that we can go from 300 million by one estimate to 18 million with another estimate. I want to touch on the last sentence of the book there. It's these insights that make me realize, and I hope, if you read this, makes other readers realize that this is all very familiar. Like, so much so that I even sometimes question if the middle class is even supposed to exist within neoliberalism. Because, as I said in the quote there, the last bit, the lower and upper limits are actually what expands the most, not the middle. And I don't know if that's come from a post-mortem of developed countries' middle class, or if we're just naturally, or the researchers are naturally observing that within Africa right now. I think it's probably both, but again, very interesting. Especially because at this point, only a few Western nations can actually point to a distinguishable middle class. And even that definition of it has changed and has been warped by all sorts of economic crises. And so now it's pretty much shrunk to minuscule levels in recent times. Well, maybe not strange, but African countries don't seem to have been able to establish a prominent middle class like the West did, yet it is already shrinking. In relation to the book, why it was made and its purpose is because when these academics were looking at articles and reports from various media outlets and institutions, they were very much banking on Africa's middle class to bring about democratic and economic change, to really drive growth within the continent, of course through commerce, consumerism and entrepreneurship, and political organizations too. So the Credit Suisse report, can 18 million people over the stretch of a continent that's bigger than all the atlas maps actually get right? Like, do they even have enough firepower to get it done? Think about how many countries and tribes and languages. It's a lot. It's a tall order. And the implications of this is that there are numerous institutions that may be betting on the wrong horse. And it'll be interesting to see as the decades go past whether the economic and democratic growth, one, will actually happen, which hopefully it does, widespread across the continent, and two, will it actually be middle class people behind it, whether it's the 18 million or 300 million or anyone in between. Would that population be the one that actually gets it done? Alas, let us not forget the African citizens though. This book gets quite a lot of input from people up and down Africa, which is something that I greatly appreciate. The insights and their mindsets prove for the umpteenth time that we're literally all the same. We're all just trying to survive whatever's been thrown at us. At the beginning of the book, we get to see insight from Ghanaians after a new shopping centre had opened. The realest thing I'd ever heard was captured by the interviewee, and to be honest, this basically sums up for normal people such as you and I what we're trying to do. Quote, one comment in particular drew considerable laughter and approval. Middle class is defined by the ability to mask poverty, by the capability to get through the month without looking dirty or poor. This is definitely one of those wow moments, just a mic drop moment for sure, because that's essentially what it's about. Again, this book, and one of the many pros of this book is that we go from multiple countries. So I'm going to touch on Tanzania, South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria, and just give you guys a few quotes from each of those countries just to see what the mentality is, just to see what's being argued by the academics in this book. In Tanzania, again, people are asked, people are surveyed all the time, of course, about how things are, what is going on, how they're doing. I love seeing the different perspectives about what middle class is. For example, we have this one quote that says, most of the respondents who categorize themselves as middle class argued that resources they have and their lifestyle is what makes them middle class. Having their children attending private schools is an achievement for them because they cannot afford to buy everything they want as the upper class do. It makes them middle class until they can afford to do the same. Speaking of education, it is touched upon a lot in this book in various countries. Well, in Tanzania, once one has attained any post-secondary education, he or she is considered as msomi, learned. The assumption is once learned, you are no longer expected to belong to the lower class. The use of the word expected comes to mind for me here. We've seen it in books and films that once a person has used their natural talent and or academic achievement to propel themselves forward, why go back? You're part of something different now. You're supposed to know more about the world, and so therefore you're supposed to sort of align yourself with, these circles, whether it's the academic circle, the creative circle, the managerial circle, whatever it is. You're supposed to be there. Education is viewed as a golden ticket. Therefore, no one should go backwards once a certain level of academic achievement has been attained, especially since the goal of said academic achievement is to get out of lower class situations. But the subtitle of this book is Myths, Realities, and Critical Engagements, and we get a lot of that with this chapter. Quote, as an example, the South African black middle class has largely increased its consumption but has failed to develop a large entrepreneurial class to exploit these opportunities. It is estimated that most of the spending power of 420 billion rand from black South African middle class, being higher by 40 billion rand than the spending power of the white middle class, is going to white businesses. It doesn't stop there in terms of this book, and I'm going to give you two more for South Africa. The first one being that the new black middle class, especially the state-employed black middle class, has been framed as a hyper-consuming class, which implicitly and explicitly is corrupt and non-productive. Words such as tenderpreneurship, rent-seeking, corruption, and deployment are used to describe the new black middle class. I want in this book, talk about corruption is not a central theme of it, which I like because we have enough books about that. But in terms of South Africa, we actually do get quite a bit of that, and it's sprinkled throughout because we are talking about. This book does talk about problems within African countries, and obviously the South African chapters talk about apartheid and the things that happened after it and the initiatives to really try to rebalance the scales and whatnot. Moving on to Kenya, again, this was a good chapter. The contributor in this factor, I forgot their name, they did a good job of really distinguishing what Kenyans actually care about politically and how their political discussions go. Because for the West, it's all about left and the right, conservatives, liberals, etc. But and let me just share this quote: the differences between Kenyan parties are not linked to basic values or attitudes such as liberal or conservative, and they do not represent political currents or basic positions. They are built upon regional ethnic blocs represented by well-known and popular leaders. Therefore, the question of ethnic representation and the amount of central state power are typical political issues. This book also touches upon, this book also has class analysis, some Marxist analysis. It is kind of sprinkled throughout. Nothing super in depth, which is kind of a con of this book, that I wanted it to go into more and to really sort of grapple with the regional ethnic side of things. In Kenya's economy, as is noted in this chapter, is just like all other ones, to be fair. 8,300 super wealthy control 2/3 of Kenya's economy. It's just the same old story. Lastly, I want to talk about Nigeria. Being Nigerian myself, I was looking forward to what it had to say about Nigeria. This was an interesting quote from him. The growth of the African middle class seems to have been quite profound in Nigeria, where about 35 million people were considered to have been pulled into the middle class since 2000. And again, even this 35 million number eclipses Credit Suisse's collective 18.8 million for the whole continent. Definitions and criteria are so important because everything is just so profoundly different. That was interesting. And again, this book this is what this book will do. It got me thinking a lot about just the state of the world and just looking at it from the perspective of if I was in Africa and I had to grow up there. And of course, with Nigerians, and I know this, and many of you will know this, very, very, very religious people, very education focused people, and again, this is captured in the book in very two distinct quotes. These will be the last two, I promise. A survey of the Nigerian middle class by Renaissance Capital found that 92% of the respondents have obtained post-secondary education or have studied at an institution of higher learning. So that was 2011. And mind you, a lot of Nigerians do even send their children out to foreign countries to study. Hell, I went to America to study. I know my cousin from Nigeria came to the UK to study. And you remember like a few years ago, that Nigerian medical student that was in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian university, that drew the picture of the pregnant black woman with a black baby in the womb. And it went like mega viral because like obviously when it comes to a lot of things, it's usually white is usually the default, so that was just different. And in her study of class formation in southwestern Nigeria, Sarah Berry, 1985, analysed how prosperous cocoa farmers, instead of using their profits to expand their commercial agriculture, invested heavily in their sons' education, which enabled them to move into non-agricultural employments. These farmers saw what was to come, and it is noted in the book that the expansion of the private sector in industries like telecommunication is a big driver in the increase of the middle class in Nigeria. So it's good to see that even from the mid 80s, before actually that was during, I guess, the first tech boom. And again, it links back to what we're saying in the previous chapters with schooling, and the status around that is very important. So yeah, the essays in this book challenge the optimistic view that Africa's middle class is a stable and growing force driving economic transformation. Instead, the contributors argue that much of what is considered middle class remains precarious, with individuals vulnerable to economic shocks, lacking access to key services such as health, and often living on the edge of poverty. Again, the book covers a wide range of countries and contexts, providing both statistical analyses and qualitative insights. Ultimately, the rise of Africa's middle class underscores that Africa's economic development is complex, and the assumptions of a rapidly expanding affluent middle class is often overstated. Thank you for listening.